before their first battle. June 5th, 1944, Southern England, 2200 hours. Private Robert Murphy sat in a tent at a Pottery airfield with the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, less than 8 hours from jumping into Normandy. He had trained for 2 years. He knew his equipment. He trusted his squad, but his hands would not stop shaking. Not from cold, not from excitement, from something he could not name and could not control. Around him, other men checked their gear for the 5th time, wrote letters they might never mail, or stared at nothing. The battalion chaplain moved through the tent offering prayers, but most men waved him away. They were not thinking about God. They were thinking about the moment the door would open, the moment they would step into darkness over France, the moment everything they had imagined would become real. What terrified them was not what they knew. It was what they could only imagine. The psychological reality of anticipation proved more destructive than most commanders anticipated. Medical records from multiple theaters reveal that the highest rates of combat stress reactions occurred not during firefights, but in the hours and days immediately preceding first contact. British psychiatrist J.T. McCurdy studied stress casualties across multiple campaigns and documented a phenomenon he called anticipatory anxiety syndrome. Soldiers becoming physically and mentally incapacitated before experiencing actual combat. The syndrome manifested in vomiting, uncontrollable trembling, temporary paralysis, and complete psychological shutdown. 1st Infantry Division records from North Africa show that during the 72 hours before Operation Torch in November 1942, battalion aid stations treated more men for stress symptoms than they would treat for combat wounds during the first 3 days of fighting. Men who had never heard a shot fired in anger were collapsing. Medical officers initially suspected malingering until they recognized the symptoms were involuntary. Bodies were rebelling against minds that could not stop imagining what combat would be like. The imagination proved more terrifying than reality because it had no limits. A man facing his first battle did not imagine one German soldier shooting at him. He imagined 100. He did not imagine being wounded in one place. He imagined being blown apart, burned alive, drowning in his own blood, dying slowly and alone. The mind, absent actual experience, filled the void with worst-case scenarios drawn from training films, rumors from veterans, and primal fears of pain and death. Without the focusing effect of actual danger, the imagination ran wild. Private Eugene Sledge, waiting to land at Peleliu with the 1st Marine Division in September 1944, later described the psychological torture of the days before invasion. He had trained for 2 years, absorbed countless briefings, and believed he understood what combat would be like. But as the landing craft approached the beach, he realized his imagination had created a version of combat more terrifying than anything training had prepared him for. He had not imagined surviving the landing. He had imagined only death in elaborate and horrifying detail. When he actually hit the beach and began moving inland, the focused intensity of immediate action proved almost a relief compared to the days of anticipatory dread. Soldiers described pre-battle fear as qualitatively different from the fear experienced during combat. Combat fear was sharp, immediate, and reactive, the body responding to a clear and present danger with heightened alertness and action. Pre-battle fear was diffuse, endless, and paralyzing, the mind responding to abstract possibilities with no outlet for the adrenaline flooding the system. One was a sprint. The other was a marathon of dread. Lieutenant Paul Fussell, waiting in England before D-Day with the 410th Infantry Regiment, recorded in his diary that he spent 3 weeks unable to sleep more than 2 hours at a time. He would wake in darkness convinced he was already wounded, already dying, already experiencing the pain he knew was coming. During training exercises, he functioned perfectly, but in his bunk at night, his imagination tortured him with scenarios his conscious mind knew were irrational, but his body believed were real. His hands developed a tremor that would not stop until weeks after he finally entered combat in France. The physical symptoms of anticipatory anxiety were documented across all theaters. Medical officers treating 1st Marine Division personnel before Guadalcanal in August 1942 reported epidemic levels of diarrhea, vomiting, and stress-induced fever. Men who were objectively healthy were exhibiting symptoms usually associated with serious illness. Battalion surgeons initially suspected food poisoning or infectious disease until they recognized the pattern. Symptoms appeared in the days before combat and disappeared once fighting began. Corporal Harold Baumgarten, preparing to land at Omaha Beach with the 116th Infantry Regiment on D-Day, spent the night of June 5, 1944, vomiting until his stomach was empty, then continuing to vomit bile and stomach acid. He was not sick. He was 20 years old, in peak physical condition, and terrified of something he could not articulate even to himself. When he hit the beach the next morning and saw men dying around him, the vomiting stopped. His body had something concrete to respond to. The endless anticipation was over. Analysis of letters, diaries, and post-war interviews reveal specific fears that dominated soldiers' thoughts before first combat. These fears were remarkably consistent across nationalities, theaters, and branches of service, suggesting universal psychological responses to the prospect of violence. The most common fear, reported by roughly 60% of soldiers in multiple studies, was not death, but failure. Men feared they would freeze under fire, abandon their friends, run away, or prove themselves cowards. This fear was particularly acute among paratroopers and assault infantry, who knew their actions would be immediately visible to their units. Private David Webster of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry, later wrote that his greatest terror before D-Day was not that he would die, but that he would fail to jump from the aircraft, that he would stand frozen in the door while other men pushed past him, that everyone would know he was a coward. The second most common fear was being wounded in ways that would leave them helpless. Death was abstract and final, but soldiers could vividly imagine lying wounded and unable to move while enemy soldiers approached, or being trapped in burning vehicles, or losing limbs and spending the rest of their lives as invalids. These fears were fed by training films and medical lectures that, attempting to prepare men for battlefield realities, instead gave their imaginations detailed material to work with. Marine Corps training films showing the effects of flamethrowers and white phosphorus gave men precise images to fear. Private Carlton Barrett, waiting to land at Tarawa with the 2nd Marine Division in November 1943, later described lying in his bunk the night before, the assault obsessively imagining being hit in the stomach. He had heard that abdominal wounds were excruciatingly painful and often fatal. His imagination had created a detailed scenario where he would be shot in the stomach, would lie on the beach for hours unable to move, would die slowly while fully conscious. When he actually landed at Tarawa and men were hit all around him, including several with abdominal wounds, the reality proved different from his imagination. The wounded men went into shock quickly. Their faces showed pain but not the prolonged agony he had imagined. His mind had created something worse than reality. The third major fear was letting down their friends. Unit cohesion training had been so effective that many soldiers feared failing their squad more than they feared death. This fear was particularly strong in elite units like paratroopers, rangers, and Marines where group identity was central to training. Men would tell themselves they could face death or wounds, but they could not face the shame of abandoning their friends. This fear drove men to perform acts of extreme courage, but also created immense psychological pressure before first combat. The final hours before first combat took on ritualistic qualities as soldiers tried to control their fear through action. Men cleaned weapons that were already clean, checked equipment that had been checked a dozen times, and performed small tasks that gave them a sense of agency in a situation where they had almost no control over their fate. Before the Normandy invasion, units of the 82nd and 101st Airborne spent June 5, 1944, in a frenzy of activity that was part preparation and part psychological defense mechanism. Men shaved their heads into mohawks, applied war paint, and engaged in aggressive displays that anthropologists would recognize as pre-battle rituals in any warrior culture. They were not preparing their bodies. They were preparing their minds. The rituals created a psychological transition from the world of peace to the world of war. Some men sought isolation and silence. Sergeant Charles Kelly of the 36th Infantry Division spent the night before landing at Salerno in September 1943, sitting alone on the deck of his transport ship, refusing to talk to anyone. He later explained that he needed to visualize what he would do when the ramp dropped, to rehearse his movements mentally until they became automatic. He did not want conversation to disrupt his concentration. When the landing craft hit the beach the next morning, his body executed the plan his mind had rehearsed, and he led his squad off the beach without hesitation. Others sought company and distraction. Poker games and dice games ran continuously aboard transport ships before major amphibious assaults. The games were not about money. They were about killing time and preventing thought. Men who would normally never gamble threw away months' pay in hours because the alternative was sitting alone with their fears. The games created artificial normal moments in deeply abnormal circumstances. Private First Class Roscoe Mullins, waiting to land at Iwo Jima with the 4th Marine Division in February 1945, joined a poker game the night before the assault. He did not know how to play poker. He lost $80 in 2 hours. He did not care. The game kept his mind occupied. Every hand dealt was another minute not spent imagining what tomorrow would bring. When the game finally broke up at 0300 hours, he had 3 hours until the landing craft loaded. He spent those 3 hours vomiting into a bucket. Writing final letters became a near-universal ritual before first combat. Men wrote letters to parents, wives, girlfriends, and children, knowing the letters might be the last words their families would receive. The letters served dual purposes. They prepared families for possible death while helping soldiers confront their own mortality. The content of these letters followed predictable patterns. Most avoided melodrama and direct acknowledgement of death. Instead, they used formulations like, "If you're reading this, something has happened to me," or "if I don't make it back." They expressed love and gratitude. They gave instructions about finances and possessions. They tried to comfort families they knew would be devastated. Writing the letters forced men to imagine their own deaths concretely, which was both terrifying and strangely calming. Once death was acknowledged directly, some of its power over the imagination diminished. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, commanding 3rd Battalion of the 507th Parachute Infantry, wrote a final letter to his wife before D-Day. The letter was matter-of-fact about the possibility of death, gave detailed instructions about insurance and savings, and asked her to remarry if he died. He sealed the letter and gave it to the battalion chaplain with instructions to mail it only if he was killed. Writing the letter forced him to confront what he had been avoiding, that he might die, that his wife might be alone, that life would continue without him. The confrontation was painful but clarifying. Once acknowledged, the fear became manageable. Cole led his battalion through D-Day and continued fighting until killed in action in September 1944 in Holland. Many letters were never mailed because the men survived, but the act of writing them had served its purpose. Private James Campbell of the 1st Infantry Division wrote a final letter to his mother before landing at Omaha Beach. The letter was tender and honest, telling her he was afraid but ready, that he loved her and was proud to serve. He survived D-Day and carried the sealed letter through France and Germany. He mailed it to her after VE Day with a note explaining he had written it on the transport ship and wanted her to have it. She kept it until her death 40 years later. The worst aspect of anticipatory fear was its tendency to create scenarios more horrible than reality. Without actual combat experience to calibrate their fears, soldiers' imaginations generated extreme possibilities that bore little resemblance to what they would actually face. Private Eugene Sledge imagined the Japanese on Peleliu as superhuman warriors who never missed a shot, never retreated, and killed Americans with casual efficiency. His imagination created an enemy that was tactically perfect and psychologically invincible. When he actually fought Japanese soldiers, he discovered they made mistakes, missed shots, and died when hit just like American soldiers. They were dangerous and determined, but not the unstoppable force his imagination had created. The reality was horrifying enough without the exaggerations his mind had added. This imaginative exaggeration was documented across all theatres. British soldiers before El Alamein in October 1942 imagined German tanks as nearly invulnerable machines crewed by elite soldiers who never panicked. When the battle began, British tank crews discovered that German armour could be penetrated, that German crews bailed out of damaged tanks just like British crews, and that the vaunted Afrika Korps was exhausted and undersupplied. The Germans were skilled opponents, but not the supermen British imagination had created. The imagination also created scenarios of total disaster. Men did not imagine being slightly wounded and evacuated. They imagined being grievously wounded and left to die. They did not imagine fighting effectively. They imagined their weapons jamming at critical moments, their grenades failing to explode, their training abandoning them. Every worst-case scenario played out in vivid detail during the endless hours before combat. Corporal Paul Rogers, waiting to jump into Normandy with the 508th Parachute Infantry, spent the final hours before takeoff imagining his parachute failing to open. He knew the probability was infinitesimally small. Riggers had checked every chute multiple times, but his imagination created a detailed scenario where his main chute malfunctioned, his reserve chute tangled, and he fell for 600 feet fully conscious and aware of his approaching death. When he actually jumped and his chute opened properly, the relief was so intense he later described it as one of the best moments of his life. His imagination had created horror that reality did not deliver. The presence of combat veterans in units preparing for first battle created complex psychological dynamics. Veterans could provide realistic information that helped calibrate expectations, but they could also amplify fears through stories that emphasized danger and death. In units preparing for major operations, commanders tried to distribute veterans throughout the ranks so that every squad had at least one experienced soldier. The theory was that veterans would provide steadying influence and practical knowledge during first combat. This strategy worked when veterans were thoughtful and careful about what information they shared. It backfired when veterans used their status to dominate conversations with war stories that emphasized chaos, death, and the inadequacy of training. Before the Normandy invasion, 1st Infantry Division units that had fought in North Africa and Sicily were filled out with replacements who had never seen combat. The veterans had mixed effects on replacement morale. Some veterans were generous with practical advice: what to carry, what to discard, how to move under fire, when to shoot, and when to conserve ammunition. They answered questions honestly without dramatizing danger. These veterans reduced fear by making combat seem manageable rather than mythical. Other veterans, either unconsciously or deliberately, used their experience to dominate and intimidate replacements. They told stories that emphasized their own survival and the deaths of other replacements. They suggested that combat was a mysterious art that could only be learned through experience and that replacements were likely to die quickly. These veterans amplified rather than reduced anticipatory fear. Replacements already terrified of combat now had their fears validated by men who had survived it. Private Ralph Puhalowicz, a replacement joining the 4th Infantry Division before D-Day, encountered both types of veterans. One sergeant gave him practical advice about movement, cover, and when to keep his head down. The advice was specific and actionable. Another veteran spent an evening telling stories about replacements who had been killed in Sicily, emphasizing how their lack of experience had gotten them killed. Puhalowicz later wrote that the second veteran's stories nearly paralyzed him with fear. He spent the night before D-Day convinced he would die because he lacked the mysterious quality veterans possessed. He survived the landing and later realized that combat was less mysterious and more mechanical than the veterans' stories had suggested. The psychological stress of anticipation created physical symptoms that sometimes became more debilitating than combat wounds. Medical officers across all theaters documented epidemic levels of stress-related illness in the days before major operations. Gastrointestinal problems were nearly universal. Roughly 70% of soldiers in units preparing for assault experienced diarrhea or vomiting in the final 24 hours before combat. The symptoms were stress-induced rather than infectious, but the physical effects were real. Men lost weight, became dehydrated, and felt physically weakened before they ever faced enemy fire. Medical officers distributed anti-diarrheal medication and intravenous fluids, but the treatments were only partially effective because the root cause was psychological. Before the landing at Tarawa in November 1943, 2nd Marine Division medical officers reported that battalion aid stations were overwhelmed with Marines suffering from stress-induced gastrointestinal distress. The transport ships' heads had lines of men waiting to use them. The smell of vomit and feces permeated troop compartments. Officers worried that Marines would be physically incapacitated before landing. When the Marines hit the beach, most of the symptoms disappeared immediately. Men who had been vomiting for hours fought effectively once combat began. Sleep disruption was another universal symptom. Medical studies of soldiers before first combat showed that average sleep duration dropped to 3 hours per night in the week before battle, with sleep quality declining even for those few hours. Men lay awake running through scenarios, reviewing training, and trying to visualize what they would do when fighting began. When they did sleep, they experienced nightmares of combat that were often more psychologically damaging than actual combat would prove to be. Sergeant William McClure of the 29th Infantry Division spent the week before D-Day averaging 2 hours of sleep per night. He would lie in his bunk, exhausted but unable to stop his mind from replaying landing scenarios. When he did sleep, he dreamed of drowning in heavy seas or being shot as he waded ashore. He woke repeatedly in darkness, convinced he was already wounded. By June 5th, 1944, he was so exhausted he could barely function. When he hit Omaha Beach on June 6th, adrenaline compensated for lack of sleep, and he fought effectively despite being awake for over 36 hours. The final minutes before first combat created a unique psychological state that veterans across all theatres described in remarkably similar terms. Time seemed to slow down. Sensory perception became extremely acute. Men noticed details they would normally ignore: the texture of fabric, the smell of oil on weapons, the exact sound of engines. The mind, hyper-focused on survival, processed information with unusual clarity. Paratroopers waiting to jump experienced this state intensely. The final minutes in the aircraft, with the jump master standing at the door counting down to green light, created a timeless moment where past and future collapsed into an eternal present. Private Donald Burgett, jumping into Normandy with the 101st Airborne, described looking around the aircraft and seeing every face with perfect clarity, as if he were viewing a photograph rather than living through a moment. He could see every detail of equipment, every expression, every small movement. The moment seemed to last forever, and yet passed instantly. Soldiers in landing craft experienced similar temporal distortion. The run from transport ship to beach typically lasted 30 to 45 minutes, but men described the time as both endless and instantaneous. Private Harry Parley, landing at Omaha Beach with the 1st Infantry Division, later wrote that the trip to the beach felt like hours, but also felt like no time at all. He was simultaneously aware of every second passing and completely disoriented about how much time had elapsed. The jumpmaster's shout of "Go!" or the landing craft ramp dropping represented the boundary between anticipation and reality. Men described stepping through that boundary as almost peaceful, despite the chaos that followed. The waiting was over. The imagination no longer mattered. Only immediate reality remained. Soldiers who survived first combat consistently reported that the anticipatory fear had been worse than the actual experience. Combat was terrifying and chaotic, but it was also concrete and immediate. The mind and body could respond to actual danger. The endless anticipation had no outlet and no resolution except the combat itself. Private Eugene Sledge wrote years later that if he had known what combat was actually like before landing at Peleliu, he would have been less terrified during the approach. His imagination had created something more horrible than reality. The actual experience was terrible enough, but it was survivable and comprehensible in ways his imagination had not been. This realization came too late to help with first combat, but changed how veterans approached subsequent battles. Men who had survived one battle were still afraid before the next, but their fear was calibrated to reality rather than imagination. They knew what to expect. They knew what they could handle. The unknown had become known. The transition from anticipation to experience represented a fundamental psychological shift. Before first combat, soldiers were civilians imagining war. After first combat, they were soldiers who knew war. The imagination lost its power because reality had replaced it. The fear remained, but it was a different kind of fear, immediate and reactive rather than abstract and endless. The terror soldiers experienced before first battle reveals a fundamental truth about human psychology under extreme stress. The imagination, designed to help us prepare for danger, can create scenarios more terrifying than reality. The waiting before combat proved more psychologically damaging than combat itself, because it gave the imagination unlimited time to generate worst-case scenarios with no way to test them against reality. Men who had trained for years, who knew their equipment and trusted their leaders, were still paralyzed by fears. their rational minds knew were exaggerated, but their bodies experienced as real. The moment actual combat began, the anticipation ended and soldiers could finally respond to concrete danger rather than imagined horror. The relief of finally engaging the enemy, regardless of how dangerous the situation actually was, proved almost welcome after the endless torture of waiting. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to World War II Archives for more untold stories from the Second World War. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and thank you for watching.